Hi class, today we're going to talk about the interplay between evolutionary biology and design arguments, and there's a couple of important interactions and a lot of questions always come up, and so that has kind of spawned this as a day involved with the design argument. But overall, um, it's helpful to try to situate these kind of topics together with things you've encountered in other disciplines, etc. So first of all, we're going to start by clarifying several terms. Apologize for that, but these are ones I hinted at the end of the last lecture. So first of all, let's talk about evolution. Now, I'm going to do something that you shouldn't do if you're, say, in a biology class. There are some important differences, but we can pretty much treat as synonyms evolution, evolutionary biology, Darwinism. That's fine. Treat those all as the same. What does that say? It's amazing how often there are misconceptions about it. But the general idea is that two components. So component one is mutation, that there are small genetic mutations that eventually can account for a whole lot of very advanced organisms. How the second component has to do with what is called fit for evolution. That is, what will help survival. So, if a small mutation is helpful to survival, it gets passed on. Survival of what? This is one place where people screw up all the time. It's not survival of the individual. It's survival of the DNA, not even of the species, of the DNA. And that is a hugely powerful explanatory mechanism. If it was just survival of the individual, none of us would be here because nobody would care about their offspring. But yeah, so it's survival of the DNA. So the assertion is that these very, very small changes over time, long, big periods of time, can create species as we know them. So let's give a very simple example. If you think of the ancestors of the giraffe, the ancestors of the giraffe looked a lot like a horse with a normal size neck. What happened? It didn't go from a mutation of the horse-like ancestor to a giraffe as we know it. No, there's many small intermediate steps. So, random mutation comes along, or seemingly random, and that causes the vertebrae in one particular giraffe ancestor's neck to be a little longer. Small mutation could be handled in a single generation. What happens? Well, that individual with a slightly longer neck can reach food at a higher level, which means it is better fed than other members of its species, which means two things. One, it will survive. Two, since it's healthy, it's more likely to attract mates, which means the slightly longer necked giraffes will reproduce with more success than the other horse-like ancestors, which means they'll eventually become dominant and take over. Fast forward another 100,000 years, another mutation happens. The neck is slightly longer still. Rinse, repeat. Over a period of million years, goes from the short horse-like ancestor to the giraffes as we know them today. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, these small changes. And we're going to talk about how evolutionary biology interacts with design arguments in a bit. Let's talk about those, the set of views that fall under creationism. So, creationism is just the claim that God creates species, or some higher power creates species. Is that incompatible with evolution? Nope. For instance, the Vatican Church, the official position, the Vatican official head of the Catholic Church, their official position is God creates through evolution. There's no incompatibility there. There's no problem there. But then there are these versions of creationism that deny evolution that come in what are called special creationism. So remember from last time, special creationism doesn't just say that God creates species, but says that God miraculously creates species. That is, God interferes with biology to create a species. So that's special creationism. I mentioned there's kind of two influential branches of special creationism. One is this entirely faith-based account called Young Earth Ism. This is generated from a certain literal reading of Christian holy texts that basically calculates that the Earth is approximately only 6,000 years old. So if the Earth was only that old, well, of course there couldn't be evolution because it takes much more time. Having said that, that's entirely faith-based. It contradicts every known science, pretty much, in terms of physics, astrophysics, biology, archaeology, paleontology, geology, etc. Entirely faith-based, which means it doesn't really have a place in the course. The second one, though, is the view that Dennett criticizes and has in his sights, and it's a little sneakier view. It's called intelligent design. First and foremost, do not confuse intelligent design, supporter of the design argument. Those are not equated. So intelligent design is specifically a view about species. It's a view about biology. It's not a view about higher powers. Intelligent design says, so first of all, it's a view in special creationism. So God miraculously interferes to deal with species in some way. Roughly speaking, the usual line with intelligent design is that there is evolution, but evolution is not enough. So, there's signs of evolution everywhere. We know that. Look down at your own foot if you're not sure, because your pinky toe is a pretty clear case. But so they accept some evolution, of course. There's overwhelming evidence. But what they say is, but evolution can't be the whole story. That evolution can't account for all features, and that therefore God must miraculously interfere in some way in order to kind of jumpstart these big species changes. So that's intelligent design, not to be confused with design argument. But notice, like Young Eartherism, it does deny evolution, not entirely though, just denies it as an account of everything, as it denies evolution's ability to account for all we see in species. All right, so let's talk about some of the topics Dennett discussed. First of all, and this is a really important one. Don't lose the forest through the trees with the details. Well, we know there's evolution. What does that do, if anything, with design arguments? Well, notice if I made a design argument and the specific feature of the world that I was saying is designed is the giraffe's neck, well, then we have a problem because evolution can very clearly and completely account for the giraffe's neck as we know it. Or very similarly, remember from the optional Paley reading, the second chapter of the Paley, where he makes the design argument from the structure of the human eye. Of course, evolution can account for the structure of the human eye, no problem. And so, what's going on there? What's going on is what Dennett calls an undermining effect. Well, here's one phenomenon, the structure of the human eye. Here's two explanations. A designer miraculously intervening to design the eye, or evolution. Well, both of them explain the data, but evolution explains it without making all these additional metaphysical assumptions, and hence is in certain ways a better established, well-documented explanation for the structure of the human eye. Hence, that argument is undermined because evolution gives a testable, very, very plausible, observed explanation for what looks like design. So what evolution can do is explain why something it looks like it's designed without actually being designed. So we use the word apparent design. Evolution can explain apparent design by appealing to mutation in a long enough timeline and the basic laws of nature and genetic recombination. So, this raises an important question. Which design arguments are so undermined? Whenever you ask a question like that, start with the three logical categories. All, some, none. Well, are no design arguments undermined that way? Of course not, because the one from the human eye certainly is. Are all design arguments undermined? No, because think of arguments from celestial mechanics, or the rate of expansion of the Big Bang, or even design arguments based on how life began. Evolution doesn't say a word about any of those things. It doesn't say anything about celestial mechanics, et cetera, et cetera. And so those design arguments aren't undermined. Nowadays, it's very popular to give design arguments from the laws of nature. Well, why are the laws this way rather than some other way? Evolution doesn't touch those. And so the answer is some. Evolutionary biology undermines some design arguments. Which ones? To be a little more specific, it's going to undermine any design argument from complex biological function. So ones like Paley's human eye one, or the structure, any given complex structure of an organism can be explained by evolution. So those are the ones that are undermined. Not all, not none, some. And so it's interesting, and it's worth talking just a minute about, well, why is it then that there's this extreme pushback with evolution? It's not incompatible with a designer. It's incompatible with a certain literal reading of the second Genesis creation. Sorry, myth is used as a technical sense there and not derogatory. That is the Adam and Eve account. Christians put a very, very specific value on that particular account. And if we read that in a certain literal way, then evolution threatens it. And so the tension is not to theism, it's to certain literal readings of certain sects of Christianity to the second Genesis creation account. So that's where the tension is. And so notice there are plenty of Christians who don't accept that particular reading. I already mentioned the Catholic Church said God creates through evolution, no problem. But there's lots of other ways of reading that text. But if you want to read it literally, then there's going to be a problem. And it's kind of a particularly U.S. issue. Like most of the world just says, well, of course there's evolution. What's the problem? But it's the evangelical Christian movement especially that tends to have a conflict there, and so it becomes a hot button in this country, whereas it's not really in others. And things get really dirty. I can almost guarantee I'm going to get nasty comments on this YouTube video just because of the topic. There's people who defended ID by lying to the New Jersey Supreme Court. There's all sorts of deceptive pseudo-research and .org sites that'll just claim almost anything. Because it's an issue near and dear to certain people, and the people it's dear to, it's very dear to, and so things get a little nasty. But it is important to realize evolution is not in tension with design arguments. It's in tension with certain literal readings of Genesis, which is kind of... I almost call that a Christian text, and it's not. So it's funny because Jewish people don't read the text that way either. Anyway, that's an aside, but I really wanted you to know where the tension is, because it leads to some just utterly despicable academic and pseudo-academic fights. So stay clear on that. So let's talk a little more about Dennett's concerns with intelligent design, abbreviated ID then. So remember, that's the view that says there's some evolution, but that it can't account for everything. Now, how might they say that? There's a couple ways, but I'm going to mention the most typical. The most typical way to defend this is to say that there are these things, and this is where things get a little tricky, uh, is to claim there are these things in nature and biology and organisms called irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity would be some sort of complex biological feature whose individual components are not fit for evolution. That is the kind of thing that, well, we had to go from A to B with all these intermediate steps, but not all the intermediate steps are evolutionarily useful. So unlike the giraffe's neck, where a little bit longer is useful, a little bit longer is useful, a little bit longer is useful, an irreducibly complex feature would be one in which not all the steps are helpful in that way. Now, why does that matter? Because if there are such things, evolution can't account for them. Evolution can only account for how fit mutations, how useful mutations that help survive get passed on. So, to defend intelligent design, some defenders say there's this thing called irreducible complexity. And there I even have to pause to tell you how sneaky and slimy things have gotten. Defenders of intelligent design have actually used different definitions of irreducible complexity, one that's perfectly compatible with evolution and one that's not. And then they'll give one to a biologist that's perfectly compatible with evolution, and the biologist will say, yeah, of course there are those in nature. And then they'll switch to the other definition and say, haha, look, a biologist just said that evolution can't account for everything. I mean, things get really sneaky. So if you're doing outside research, be really careful on your sources. But the definition for intelligent design I used, that is a complex structure where not each step is evolutionarily fit, those are the ones that are incompatible with evolution as the whole story. So if there are irreducible complexities in that sense, then evolution cannot account for all biological features and therefore can't be the whole story. Now, whenever I'm doing this lecture in class, someone will always raise their hand and say, I'm not really sure I get that. Can you give me an example? And the answer is no, I can't, because none have ever been found. So that's the issue. Dennett is quite clear in saying there is no experiment, no evidence that challenges evolution as a whole account. He's quite explicit about that and quite correct. And I do double check with the biology department every semester or so to make sure there's nothing new and groundbreaking I haven't heard about. But that's the general idea. So let's talk about Dennett's criticisms of intelligent design. There's really three types of criticism. Interestingly enough, the least damaging one is that it's probably false. Why? Just use your axiom of induction that we discussed last video. Well, look, here's two hypotheses. There are irreducible complexities. There are not irreducible complexities. Well, here's a piece of evidence. Lots and lots of people have looked and one has never, ever, ever been found. That is expected if there are none, but that would actually be shocking if there were irreducible complexities. And so it's probably false. Imagine an analogous case. Imagine I said, oh, well, there are some naturally purple horses in the world. And then suppose you add the following evidence. Well, none have ever been found. And I say, okay, I'm going to put a $10 million reward if anybody ever finds one. People still keep looking. Nobody ever finds one. That's the general idea of what's kind of at stake here. If someone were to find an irreducible complexity, first of all, they'd be an instant multimillionaire because there's all sorts of foundations that have basically reward offers out. They would probably get a Nobel Prize like that. And they'd have also proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that there is a higher power. It would be the biggest news story in the history of mankind if an irreducible complexity was found. And so the stakes are really high, and yet no one's ever found one, is a very good reason to think there are none, which means ID is probably false. Again, if you go to crappy .org websites, you'll find people who say all these things are irreducibly complex that have actually been proven not to be irreducibly complex. So just careful with your sources. If the author hasn't won a Nobel Prize, you could probably ignore it, because that would have happened if they found one. Interestingly enough, the fact that ID is probably false is the least damaging objection. The second objection, and this is the one that Dennett spends the least time on, but we could really flesh out a little, is that it's a really unsatisfactory theology. That is, think of what this theory would say about a designing God. And it just kind of paints an unflattering picture. So imagine this omnipotent, infinite deity, powerful and clever enough to create the whole universe. And then 150 years ago, when Darwin publishes On the Origin of the Species, this omnipotent God goes, "Ah, that's brilliant. Why didn't I think of that?" That would be weird. Or there's also the fact that, it just kind of makes God a tinkerer, a being who can't get it right the first time and has to just keep fiddling with it. As Leibniz said, God is the perfect clockmaker is the one who sets a clock that you don't need to constantly fix, that keeps time correctly. And any of these views that deny evolution turn God into a tinkerer, which might be theologically undesirable. Darwin himself said, "So much more for the glory of God." What does that mean? Think in terms of, if there's a God, one thing that God must have done is fix all the laws of nature, the laws of physics, the laws of biology, the laws of genetic recombination. So we already know that if there's a God, it would have had to have interacted at that level. But add this kind of second level, well, isn't it much cooler to design laws that actually allow for this huge variation in species than instead of just building the specific species? Create one set of laws instead of 10 million different species, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm not saying you have to accept this, but in terms of, think about what you think a God should look like, whether you're a theist or atheist. Think about what a God should look like, and then ask yourself, does a God who's interfering with species, does that improve or hinder the depiction of a God? And a lot of people say it hinders it. So there's kind of the theological concern. Dennett's criticism, and definitely the most important one here, is that intelligent design is unscientific. Notice that's a very, very different claim than saying it's probably false. Because a hypothesis could be a scientific hypothesis, but still be false. We've had lots of those. So what does he mean there? There's really kind of a two-part criticism about why ID, intelligent design, is anti-scientific in some ways. First, go back to some of those websites that say, hey, look at all these things that are irreducible complexities. Think about what goes on there. Some biologist looks at some species and looks at some of the components and structures, and they find this thing that's, hey, this seems like it might be irreducibly complex. Well, what does the intelligent designer do there? They say, yes, woohoo, yay, we are done with science. We don't have to do science anymore. They want to find the unsolvable. They want to find the things that evolution cannot prove. And that's a fundamentally unscientific attitude. What does the biologist do? Say, oh, that's puzzling. Let's figure out how evolution accounts for that. And every time they take that mindset, they find it. And so you have the intelligent designer who basically wants to worship mysteries, and the scientist who wants to solve mysteries. And that's why it's kind of this unscientific attitude. The intelligent designer wants to find the unexplainable, and that's a fundamentally unscientific attitude. Not going to go far in science with that attitude. So that's kind of the big picture criticism. There's a much more specific criticism, though, and this is a trickier one. But the general idea is it's definitional in terms of what makes science science. So set aside ID for a minute and just talk in general about what makes science science? What makes a scientific hypothesis a scientific hypothesis? And we could connect a little bit to what we talked about at the beginning of the year in terms of the distinction between science and philosophy. One of the things that makes scientific hypotheses scientific is you can state conditions that would disprove them. So, for instance, think of the laws of gravity. Well, are those scientific hypotheses? Let's check. Can I state some sort of observation that would disprove the laws of universal gravitation as a general hypothesis? Sure. If I dropped this pen under normal circumstances and it didn't fall to the earth at 9.8 meters per second, that would disprove the law of gravity as a hypothesis. Now notice it didn't occur, but that's about what makes the hypothesis true, not about what makes it science. And so, again, a scientific hypothesis, by definition, what makes science science is that there are some sort of statable observations that would prove the hypothesis false. If you don't have that, you're in a different discipline, such as philosophy or metaphysics or etc. Something that is not observation-based. So, now let's apply that to ID. Here's the problem. The intelligent design supporter accepts some evolution. They have to. There's signs of it everywhere. But they also allow miracles. And miracles are basically the death of science because they can't be disproven. You say, well, yep, there's all these structures in humans that are imperfect and look like they were designed by evolution. But God just snapped its fingers and made humans look like that. Well, how could you disprove that? You can't. And so as soon as you accept some evolution, but then allow random miracles, your view is unfalsifiable. And that's a bad thing. There are no statable conditions that would prove the intelligent designer's hypothesis false. Or the funny thing is sometimes they'll accidentally state something that has been proven. So ask an ID defender, well, what would prove your view is false? You're going to get one of two answers. They're going to give you something that actually has already happened, or they're not going to have an answer. So I asked this one time, and they said, well, if we had anything in the fossil record that showed all the intermediate species. And I say, oh, great, we have that. They're called horses. We actually have, which the fossil record is incredibly incomplete, so it's shocking we even have any. But, horses' ancestors were these teeny little three or four-toed things, and then, of course, current horses are these big one-toed creatures, and we have every intermediate species. So, if you say that God was somehow involved there, you'd say, what? They genocided the little four-toed one and then created a slightly larger one, genocided that, created a slightly larger one. You could say that. There's nothing inconsistent with the data that says that, but that can't be disproven. As soon as you say God is miraculously moving from A to B, there is no way to disprove the hypothesis. So, to take a really basic analogy, imagine if when I turn on a light switch, the lamp comes on, and I say, well, yeah, but the switch was just a coincidence that it was actually God that made the light occur at the exact moment I threw the switch. Is there any way to disprove that? There's not. And that's what happens. I mean, that's ultimately why religion and science are two different disciplines, because as soon as you start throwing miracles into the mix, you're just talking about something besides science. Why? Not because of the topics, but because of the methodology. The very fact that once there are miracles in the mix, hypotheses can never be disproven means they're not science. And so that's a funny thing about ID. For Dennett, that resolves all the issues because ID is always presented as this scientific alternative to evolution, even though it's not science. And so, overall, 3 criticisms of intelligent design. 1, probably false. 2, has some very questionable theology, so think in terms of what does that tell you about the creator deity. Most important, 3, it is not science for Dennett because 1, engenders a fundamentally unscientific attitude of hoping to find the unsolvable, but more importantly, 2, it fails the falsifiability criterion. Any scientific hypothesis must have statable observations that would show it to be false, because ID accepts all the evolution we see, basically, but allows miracles. We cannot ever state observations that would prove it false, which is actually a bad thing. If it's supposed to be science, that's a very bad thing. Otherwise, we'll see you next time, where we're going to start talking about the problem of evil. Before you read the Hume, let me say a couple of things. First, Google the difference between the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil, because there are two Hume readings, chapters 10 and 11 of the dialogues. Chapter 10 is pretty much entirely about the logical problem of evil. Chapter 11 is pretty much entirely about the evidential problem of evil. And if you don't realize those are two slightly different discussions going on, you're going to have trouble with the reading. I will do those lectures in two sections. If you want to read chapter 10 and then watch the first video, read chapter 11 before watching the second video, and then read the Dostoevsky for the discussion. Otherwise, we will see you next time.